President Trump's raising tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25% to 50%.
Well, it will have an impact ultimately. Cars and trucks, home appliances, machinery, airplanes, building materials that we use to build homes, and food and beverage cans.
In less than 12 months, the United States quietly lost access to more than half of its most reliable aluminum supply, triggering cost increases across automobiles, aircraft, construction, and defense industries. While Canada redirected billions of dollars worth of aluminum to Europe and Asia without shutting down a single smelter. This is not a diplomatic dispute. This is not a headline trade spat. This is the structural consequence of a trade war that has reshaped North American supply chains in real time. Canadian aluminum shipments to the United States had dropped sharply, while exports to the European Union and Asia surged. Smelters in Quebec, British Columbia, and Labrador continued operating near full capacity. Only the destination changed. Inside the United States, aluminum prices rose, production costs climbed, and manufacturers began absorbing pressures that would soon reach consumers. But the most damaging consequences have not yet surfaced. Because behind this shift lies a decision that is now forcing some of America's largest industrial champions into a corner. And before this analysis ends, we will reveal the hidden vulnerability inside the United States supply chain that few policymakers publicly acknowledge, but many corporations are already paying for. What unfolded next was not a slow adjustment. It was a structural fracture. Within months of Canada redirecting aluminum flows, manufacturers inside the United States began reporting immediate cost pressures that could not be offset by domestic production. Primary aluminum output inside the United States simply did not have the capacity, speed, or consistency to replace Canadian supply at scale. This was not a temporary imbalance, it was a hard constraint. Aluminum prices inside the United States moved sharply higher, affecting everything from vehicle frames to aircraft components. For industries operating on thin margins, even a small increase in material costs translated into millions of dollars in additional expenses across production lines. Executives privately warned that long-term contracts signed under old assumptions were becoming financially unsustainable. At the same time, Canada's aluminum industry showed no signs of distress. Smelters continued running near maximum capacity, workers remained employed, revenues were preserved. The only visible change was geographic. Aluminum that once crossed the southern border now moved east across the Atlantic and west across the Pacific. This asymmetry is what alarmed analysts, because when one side absorbs rising prices, disrupted planning, and margin compression while the other maintains stability, the issue is no longer trade policy. It becomes economic exposure. And here is the critical point most headlines missed. The industries now under pressure are not peripheral. They sit at the core of American manufacturing power. And next, we examine how this fracture moved from balance sheets into boardrooms, and why some executives now admit the damage may already be irreversible. For Stellantis, the aluminum shock exposed a vulnerability years in the making. Stellantis steadily reduced its manufacturing footprint in Canada, shifting production and investment closer to the United States market under the assumption that North American supply chains would remain integrated and predictable. At the time, the logic appeared sound. Canadian aluminum was abundant, affordable, and treated as a given. That assumption collapsed under the weight of the trade war. When tariffs intensified and Canada redirected aluminum away from the United States, Stellantis faced an immediate input cost shock. Aluminum is not a marginal material in modern vehicles. It is central to structural frames, body panels, and weight reduction strategies that allow automakers to meet efficiency standards and consumer expectations. As Canadian aluminum became more expensive or less accessible under tariff pressure, Stellantis was forced to seek alternatives. Domestic aluminum supply inside the United States lacked both scale and uniform quality. Imports from other regions introduced longer logistics routes, higher insurance costs, and new geopolitical risks. Internally, the impact was swift. Profit margins narrowed, production planning became volatile, executives warned that vehicle pricing assumptions built before the trade war were no longer valid. The irony is difficult to ignore. Stellantis once viewed its reduced exposure to Canada as a strategic advantage. By the end of 2025, that decision had transformed into a structural liability, one amplified by tariffs that offered no clear path to relief. If Stellantis represents legacy manufacturing strain, Tesla illustrates how the aluminum shock collides with the future of transportation. Tesla's design philosophy relies heavily on aluminum to reduce vehicle weight, extend driving range, and support the structural demands of electric platforms. From frames to body shells to battery enclosures, aluminum is foundational. For years, Canada provided Tesla with a stable upstream environment. Canadian aluminum offered consistency, scale, and increasingly low-carbon credentials that aligned with Tesla's public sustainability narrative. That stability fractured when tariffs escalated. Inside the United States, aluminum producers could not rapidly meet Tesla's volume or quality needs. Expanding domestic capacity requires years, not months. Turning to international suppliers introduced new layers of uncertainty, including shipping delays and exposure to volatile energy markets. The result was a squeeze that rarely appears in quarterly headlines, but quietly reshapes long-term risk. Rising material costs threaten margins, supply uncertainty complicates production forecasts, and every disruption increases the likelihood that costs eventually reach consumers. For a company built on precision, predictability, and vertical integration, aluminum became the weak link. What makes this moment especially severe is timing. Tesla is expanding production, not contracting. Every constraint now compounds at scale. And as automakers across the United States absorb these pressures simultaneously, the broader question emerges: is this a temporary adjustment inside a trade war or the beginning of a permanent shift away from North American industrial integration? Because next, we turn to an industry where aluminum is not just a cost factor, but a safety-critical material, and where delays carry consequences measured not in margins, but in global competitiveness. For Boeing, aluminum is not simply a commodity. It is a safety-critical material embedded in every layer of aircraft manufacturing, from fuselage structures to wings, load-bearing frames, and internal components. Aluminum defines aircraft integrity, performance, and certification. Any disruption in quality, consistency, or delivery schedules immediately cascades across production timelines. For decades, Canada served as one of Boeing's most reliable upstream partners. Canadian aluminum met stringent aerospace standards, arrived predictably, and flowed through a tightly coordinated North American industrial ecosystem. That stability allowed Boeing to plan years ahead, manage costs, and meet delivery commitments to airlines around the world. The trade war fractured that system. As tariffs intensified and Canadian aluminum was redirected away from the United States, Boeing faced an impossible equation. Domestic aluminum capacity inside the United States could not scale quickly enough to replace Canadian volumes without compromising consistency. Alternative international suppliers introduced longer lead times, regulatory complexity, and heightened exposure to geopolitical disruption. The consequences were immediate but largely invisible to the public. Production schedules tightened, buffer inventories shrank. Any delay, even measured in days, translated into millions of dollars in penalties and renegotiated delivery contracts. Inside the company, executives began treating aluminum not as a cost issue, but as a strategic vulnerability. And that vulnerability did not remain confined to Boeing alone. While Boeing absorbed mounting pressure, aircraft manufacturers outside the United States quietly gained ground. European aerospace firms operating within markets that maintained direct access to Canadian aluminum through alternative trade routes avoided the same tariff exposure. Their supply chains remained intact, their cost structures remained stable, their delivery schedules held. This imbalance reshaped competition in subtle but decisive ways. Airlines evaluating new aircraft purchases began factoring reliability alongside price and performance. In an industry where confidence is currency, even small disruptions shift long-term contracts. The paradox is stark. Policies designed to protect domestic manufacturing ended up constraining one of the United States' most strategically important exporters. Beyond commercial aviation, the implications extend further. Aluminum is embedded in defense platforms, satellites, and critical infrastructure. Supply uncertainty at this level introduces national security considerations that cannot be offset by short-term policy wins. What Canada demonstrated through its aluminum pivot was not hostility, but leverage. By maintaining production while changing destination, Canada insulated itself from disruption while exporting instability downstream. For the United States, the warning signal is clear. When a single policy decision creates simultaneous stress across automobiles, aerospace, and defense, the issue is no longer sector-specific. It becomes systemic. And next, we confront the uncomfortable question policymakers rarely address openly, whether the United States is gaining strategic resilience from this trade war or quietly surrendering it. Because the final section reveals how this aluminum shift is reshaping alliances, long-term investment flows, and the balance of industrial power far beyond North America. From Washington's perspective, tariffs were intended to restore leverage. The logic was straightforward. By raising the cost of foreign inputs, domestic production inside the United States would expand, jobs would return, and strategic dependence would decline. In theory, this approach promised resilience. In practice, the aluminum shift exposed a deeper vulnerability. Primary aluminum production cannot be expanded on demand. Smelters require massive capital investment, long permitting timelines, and stable energy inputs. By the time tariffs altered price signals, the structural capacity inside the United States was already locked in. As a result, tariffs raised costs faster than they created alternatives. Manufacturers faced immediate pressure, automakers absorbed higher input prices, aerospace firms confronted supply uncertainty, downstream industries began passing costs forward, inching closer to consumers through vehicle prices, transportation costs, and infrastructure spending. This is where the trade war enters dangerous territory. Instead of insulating the economy, tariffs redistributed risk. They transferred exposure from foreign suppliers to domestic firms, workers, and consumers. The burden did not disappear, it moved inward. And while policymakers framed this as a temporary adjustment, markets responded as if the disruption could persist for years. Capital hesitated, long-term contracts were renegotiated, investment decisions slowed. But the most consequential shift was happening outside the United States. Canada's response revealed a different strategic mindset. Rather than escalating politically, Canada focused on optionality. By diversifying aluminum exports across Europe and Asia, Canada reduced reliance on any single market while strengthening its reputation as a stable, rules-based supplier. This repositioning carried ripple effects. European manufacturers gained access to low-carbon aluminum without trade friction. Asian industrial buyers secured long-term supply contracts at predictable prices. Canada embedded itself deeper into emerging clean energy and infrastructure supply chains. In contrast, the United States found itself negotiating from a position of urgency rather than confidence. The trade war reshaped relationships in ways that tariffs alone cannot reverse. Trust, once eroded, does not return on command. Supply chains redesigned under pressure tend to remain diversified even after tensions ease. What makes this moment especially consequential is precedent. Other resource-rich countries are watching closely. The lesson is clear. Leverage does not come from isolation, but from being indispensable. Canada demonstrated that power lies not in confrontation, but in control over strategic inputs. For the United States, the aluminum shock raises a question that extends far beyond metal. If tariffs can disrupt automobiles, aerospace, and defense simultaneously, what happens when similar policies collide with energy, semiconductors, or critical minerals? Because the final chapter of this story has not yet been written. And in the conclusion, we confront the uncomfortable reality that the biggest cost of this trade war may not appear in trade statistics, but in lost strategic flexibility that is far harder to recover. The most dangerous consequences of the aluminum shift are not immediate. They are structural. Once supply chains break, they do not snap back. Contracts signed with European and Asian buyers often span multiple years. Infrastructure investments follow those contracts. Logistics networks reorient. Capital commits where certainty exists. For the United States, this creates a time asymmetry problem. Even if tariffs were reduced tomorrow, domestic aluminum capacity would still require years to expand. Skilled labor would still need to be trained. Energy costs would still need to stabilize. Environmental permitting would still slow timelines. Meanwhile, Canada's aluminum industry is locking in long-term relevance. By anchoring itself to clean energy grids and low-carbon production, Canada positions aluminum not as a commodity, but as a strategic input for electric vehicles, renewable infrastructure, and defense modernization. This is where policy miscalculation becomes difficult to undo. Trade wars assume reversibility, supply chains do not. And as this gap widens, the United States faces a choice between subsidizing inefficiency at enormous fiscal cost or accepting long-term dependence on foreign-aligned supply routes that now bypass North America altogether. Aluminum was never the endgame. It was the signal. Canada's pivot demonstrates how quickly leverage can shift when a trusted supplier decides to stop absorbing political risk on behalf of another economy. The lesson is being studied carefully by producers of energy, critical minerals, and advanced materials. What happens if similar decisions ripple outward? The United States relies on integrated supply chains not just for metals, but for batteries, electronics, aerospace components, and defense systems. If aluminum can be rerouted quietly and efficiently, other materials can follow. This is the shock policymakers rarely model. Not retaliation, not sanctions, but withdrawal. And withdrawal does not announce itself. It shows up later as higher prices, slower innovation, constrained choices, and declining competitiveness. Canada did not escalate. Canada adjusted. And that distinction may define the next phase of global trade. Because when supply chains move without headlines, by the time consequences are visible, leverage is already gone. And in the final section, we confront the question that now hangs over Washington, corporate boardrooms, and consumers alike, whether this trade war strengthened the United States' position or exposed how fragile it had become. What began as a policy decision has evolved into a structural shift with long-lasting consequences. The trade war was framed as a test of strength. Tariffs were designed to protect domestic industry, restore leverage, and reduce dependence. Yet the aluminum shock tells a more complex story. The United States did not lose production overnight. It lost predictability, flexibility, and control over a critical supply chain. Canada did not escalate. Canada adapted. By redirecting aluminum rather than restricting output, Canada preserved jobs, stabilized revenues, and embedded itself deeper into global industrial networks. The United States, meanwhile, absorbed higher costs across automobiles, aerospace, infrastructure, and defense, with pressure steadily moving downstream toward consumers and workers. This is the uncomfortable reality of modern trade conflicts. Power no longer lies solely in market size or political pressure. It lies in who controls indispensable inputs and who can move them quietly when risk rises. The aluminum shift is not an isolated event. It is a preview. If supply chains can be restructured without confrontation, without retaliation, and without headlines, then the true cost of this trade war may not appear in official statistics for years. And when it does, it will not be measured in tariffs collected or deals announced, but in competitiveness lost and options foreclosed. So the question now facing policymakers, corporations, and voters is unavoidable. Is this a bold strategy that will eventually strengthen the United States, or a risky mistake whose full consequences have not yet surfaced?